Hello, and welcome back. I am Max Strasser. I'm a senior editor with the opinion section of the New York Times based in London, and I will be moderating a conversation we'll have now about the metrics of democracy. I think it's a really interesting topic that actually raises and touches on a lot of bigger questions. We're going to be talking about whether or not democracy can be measured, how it can be measured, should it be measured, but I think in the process we're going to ask questions about power, about politics, that's going to touch on a lot of really interesting stuff. I'm joined here in Athens by Dawn Nakagawa. She's the Executive Vice President of the Bergen Institute. And John Silver. He's the founder of the New Citizenship Project.
John Alexander.
And, sorry?
John Alexander. John Silver.
John Silver. John Alexander.
I'm a
pirate. John Alexander of the New Citizenship Project. And hopefully, soon, digitally, we'll be joined by Annika Silva Linder of the International IDEA. But for now, let's start with those of us in the studio. I'm going to put the first question to both of you. I'm going to ask the most basic question. Can you measure democracy?
Go on, Dawn.
Dawn?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I think, no matter how you go about trying to measure democracy, it's going to be imperfect, right? It's going to be imperfect. You have to take into account a lot of very qualitative measures, a lot of qualitative things, and therefore there's going to be an enormous amount of sort of bias and subjectivity in it. With that said, I think it's really important to try. And the reason is what we measure becomes how we see things and how we understand things to be. And I think if we don't try to measure it, then we really don't know. We don't have a baseline of how we're doing. Democracy is an ever-evolving project, right? It is never perfect, and it's something that we always want to improve. And how can we possibly know how to improve it if we're not trying to measure where we're doing well and where we're not? So I think it's like many things, it's an imperfect process, but it's an important one, and we have to try.
Okay. John?
I agree to an extent. I think there's and we've seen here this morning some of the people use the word democracy to mean different things,
right.
and there's a real danger when there's a lack of precision in what we're talking about. I mean, sometimes I think I agree, and sometimes I also think we can overcomplicate, and sometimes just like asking the straight-out question, like, do you believe you live in a democracy, might be and there's actually a thing called the Democratic Perceptions Index that came through the other day that, well, I think it was something like, I won't get the number quite right, so don't quote me, but something like 70% of the population of Hungary don't believe they live in a democracy, which is a really interesting kind of thing to bring into a conversation.
That is interesting because the Hungarian foreign minister was here earlier today, and he said that his prime minister was the most democratic prime minister in Europe. So seems like maybe there's a mismatch of perceptions, but that raises a question. I mean, to me, that raises another question. If the Hungarian government designed its own metric of democracy, which did find that Viktor Orban was the most democratic prime minister of Hungary, what does that tell us about how trustworthy these kind of indices and metrics are?
Yes, and no doubt, facts can be manipulated all the time to tell this. You can tell the same story or different stories with the same facts depending on how you're telling the story, right? And so they are, the other problem is, in addition to maybe overcomplicating, they can oversimplify it, right? So if you just look at, we were talking about this earlier, if you're just measuring whether or not you have elections and how those elections are run, is that really enough to say you have a democracy? What about civil liberties? What about the rule of law? What about how people perceive it? Just having elections does not a democracy make. Yet there are indices out there that will measure whether or not you have one just based on that baseline.
So what do you think are the most, I'm going to put this to both of you, what do you think are the most important factors to put into a measurement of a democracy?
I guess, so I'm working on a project at the moment that we're calling the Citizen Confidence Index. And that the idea behind this, and actually, as you were saying, like this is where measures open up a whole set of the conversations about what we mean by democracy, what it is, who has the power, which is a huge part of the answer to your previous question about like whoever has the power can decide what the measures are, but measures also themselves carry power.
Right.
So the reason why we're talking about a Citizen Confidence Index is because I'm looking at the sort of the broad global conversation about what success of a society is, and I see two measures actually being very powerful in that conversation. One is GDP, which has been critiqued in a lot of places. Yeah. The other is the Consumer Confidence Index, which is relatively less subject to critique. But actually, I would argue is in some ways a more influential and more powerful measure because it carries a story about what our role as consumers / citizens is in the success of our nations. And I actually would argue that the Consumer Confidence Index is a very problematic construct because it's carrying a story that says the limit of our role is to buy more stuff, that our role in the success is consumption. So to answer your question directly, for me, questions about power and agency, and I think they can be subjectively answered, like to what extent do you feel you have you can shape the context of your life, is a fascinating question that can be directly asked and directly answered, and we're exploring around that.
And do you think that that's necessarily going to correlate to democracy, or are these separate questions? I mean, are these separate issues? I'm putting this to both of you.
Well, and I think there's sort of a meta question about this, right? Why are we measuring democracy? Why do we think it's worth measuring? I think we believe that democracy, we collectively believe, and I certainly believe, that democracy delivers a better quality of life.
Sure.
Right? So measuring just democracy may not be enough. When you ask what's the most important, sure, there are certain aspects of democracy. Yes, you need elections, you need civil liberties, you need certain protections under the rule of law, you need to hold government to account. There are a whole bunch of things that you would need to say this is a strong and capable democracy. But with just looking at that and not looking at the quality of life outcomes, what's the point? You may have the best democracy in the world, but if it's not delivering the goods, then what else do you need to be looking at?
And importantly, this is the words quality of life are really important, not necessarily material standards of living. There is a distinction between those things. So and the reason why, and I think this sort of strikes the heart of what we're talking about, resilience and renewal. Like for a long time, maybe we've allowed the concepts of the free market and democracy to be kind of elided into one, and we've said and actually sort of separating those out a little bit and understanding, like, do we have material standards of living, but do we have agency? Do we have power? Do we have life satisfaction? Do we have those things? Right, a sense of purpose. These are the.
So how do we go about sort of doing that decoupling? How do we start with that? I mean, do you think we start with the question, start with, you know, what are we measuring, what are we asking, or do you think we start with political processes and then sort of get our metrics to catch up with us later?
Well, one of the big failings of doing indices, of trying to measure things generally, is that you're always looking backward, right? So we were just talking about this, you know, if you were to look at, if I was to try to evaluate, and we're actually in the process of doing an index right now, we're going to publish it in 2022. The data is going to be based on 2020 data. So you're always looking backward, right? And there is, I think, a bigger question about whether that's the most important thing to do. What about perception? What about thinking about looking forward? What about what the future looks like? As we start to decouple, hopefully we will decouple this, like at least our current definition of capitalism, our current form of capitalism, from democracy, or else we risk losing both, right? Yeah. Because we can't have this form of capitalism on a finite planet and survive the project. We will not survive, right? So we have to figure a way to do this. At the same time, I think there's a lot of great ideas about how to reinvent democracy, and that we actually, the demands right now are that we do that, right? The kind of democracy we've had to date is a consumer democracy. It's based on an industrial model and an industrial society, industrial scale and cadence expectations. But we're not that society anymore. And we know that our market economy is not working, and it's actually not a sustainable model. So we have to change that too. So we have to reinvent both at the same time. And therefore, what we are measuring now, being always, in retrospect, may not help us get to where we need to go.
So what are the questions we should be asking? What are the questions we should be asking now then?
I mean, I do see it slightly differently in a way, in that there are different kinds of measure, right? There are subjective measures, there are sort of quantifiable objective measures, and some of those things take longer to come in. Subjective measures can be a little bit more nimble. Yeah. There are also different ways of using measures, and one of the things I'm really interested in is the way that we use measures as parts of conversations about what we want to do and where we want to be. So one of the most interesting proposals that's been made in recent years is the economist Kate Raworth talks about the donut economy. And the idea here is that you have a kind of an inner sort of circle, as it were, that we must not slip beneath, of human dignity. and an outer circle that we must not go beyond in our economic and social activity of environmental limits. And between that lies the donut. And what she's done with this concept, it's a beautiful concept, is to create sort of discussion guides and so forth that enable people on a city by city or even a community by community basis to map their impacts and map where they are on those different things. So Amsterdam, for example, is on a city-wide project to think about, like, what's Amsterdam's donut? And that's a very different use of measures because it creates a conversation about what kind of society do we want to be and empowers that conversation rather than being a kind of 2 years later or 5 years later, oh look, American democracy seems to have had a bit of a problem. I shouldn't, like, UK democracy seems to be having a bit of a problem, right? So, but those retrospective things at that kind of grand level are very different from the very kind of granular use of measures as tools to structure and unlock citizen energy, I think. And so that's sort of, I think, one of the most interesting spaces for measures at the moment.
I think that's a really interesting space too. I mean, I think it raises questions though of who's doing the designing, right? Is a metric that's designed to measure the donut in Amsterdam going to be equally applicable when you take it to Jakarta? You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, or do you think that we need to ensure that the processes are democratic for how we measure and assess these things?
Right. I mean, in the case of the donut work, there's. I didn't mean to come on here and be a kind of promoter of the donut.
I like the donut theory. It's good.
I'm happy.
You're selling donuts.
There you go. Yeah. There is a process of kind of reviewing and understanding what elements apply to this place. It's sort of and there's another tool called the Place Standard, which is spreading across the UK at local government level at the moment, which is much simpler and more limited, but is just about, like, where are we on a number of key metrics that we believe make up the thriving of our place. And there's a starting set of discussions to have. And the first phase of the process is to go, what do we want to measure? Like, are these the things that we believe constitute it for us?
So to your question, though, I think that in there lies the sort of kernels of what the new democracy should look like. I think we all need to be part of the process of defining, you know, what is the limits of dignity and what's the limits of, I guess, the environment around us. These tools are only useful as jumping off points, right? For where do we have to go next? Right. I mean, in a process of, like, you know, how are we perceiving our experience? How are we perceiving our experience of democracy, and how are we experiencing that? Is it real for us? Well, obviously, everybody needs to be involved in that kind of. But when you're also defining what the future looks like and what matters to you, then I do think it should be a consensus development by community. Yeah.
And so go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think this strikes the sort of where we're at with the evolution of democracy at the moment and the potential evolution of democracy. Like, the sorts of ways of using measures that we're talking about lend themselves much more to modes of democracy involving deliberation, deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, the time between elections, as Alberto Alemanno put it the other day. It's not whereas tools and measures that are about kind of stepping back and in the cold light of day, a year on, seeing where we're at, lend themselves much more to the kind of to putting information into the hands of solely of those in power to make the decisions about where we go next. Right. So it is wrapped up in the evolution of even what we mean, what kind of democracy we want to live in.
Yeah, and there has been, I think, a deterioration of the confidence in elites to do these kinds of things, right? Either to define the tools in the first place or to figure out what we do with them afterwards. And that, you know, good or bad, there are, I think, some upsides and downsides to that. It does sort of, you know, define a path forward.
I want to hear a little bit more about what you think are the upsides and the downsides of that loss of trust in our ability to measure.
Well, I mean, the loss of trust in elites, of course, has a downside, right? Now we're awash in misinformation. Everybody's a doctor and an epidemiologist. I mean, I think we have a lot of problems in our society because we've no longer trusted elites. I think the upside is it actually sort of it sort of points to a path forward where we actually have to come together and start to make decisions. And that is probably the right decision collectively for us, but also should redefine the parameters of what our democracy looks like. And I think that's a much better, stronger, and more resilient democracy for the future.
It's fascinating because we're in this moment in time where simply defending the model of democracy we have, I would argue simply isn't enough. And so the danger is when we confuse things that are attacks on democracy with attempts to evolve and develop democracy. And I think the latter are essential.
Right.
But they often get perceived as attacks. So deliberative democracy processes, for example, citizens' assemblies, these sorts of things,
Right.
are sometimes seen as a threat to the existing representative structures.
Right.
Whether explicitly or whether that's admitted to or not, I think it is a major barrier to those things taking hold. And yet they are really the proposals to institutionalize deliberative democracy, the proposals to bring those sorts of methods in are, as far as I can see, the best way to kind of buttress and reinforce democracy in the face of authoritarianism.
I think not just authoritarianism, but stagnation or sort of stasis, right? Like I think that's where that's what I think. As much as authoritarianism is a threat, this feeling of a crisis of stagnation is also a threat, especially in the West, in Western Europe and North America. And I think everyone is trying to think of proposals on how to move, how to escape from that place that we're in right now.
Just to pitch a measure into this conversation that also frames
Not
some
a
of what
donut?
we're saying. Not a donut
A
this
croissant.
time. Another one.
What?
Another baked good.
Right.
No, there's a really fascinating aspect to the conversation about trust that comes back to measures. So we talk an awful lot about, do people trust government? And various scholars, so Audrey Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan, Beth Simone Novak, who was formerly the chief technology officer for Obama, both of them and others are starting to say, well, we talk an awful lot about that, but no one really asks or measures the extent to which government trusts citizens. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is, for me, that's a really powerful kind of idea. Like, do government, and what would it look like to measure the extent to which we believe that citizens are creative, collaborative creatures who can and want to sort of put in their ideas and energy and resources versus seeing them as lazy, selfish individuals to be kind of managed.
Right. Don, do you think that that's something, do you think that government's trust in citizens is something that we should be measuring too and that should go into some of these?
Well, I think that's one of the problems with the measures that we have right now. The indices that we have, as I said, they're always looking backward, but if you're only measuring they don't measure participatory processes. They don't generally include anything around deliberation or collective intelligence or any of that, right? So inevitably, if you're measuring only the electoral representative democracy you have now, the data you're going to be building off of is only going to help you improve that.
Right.
Frankly, that's not what we need right now. What we need is, we need innovation, we need creativity, we need bringing people together, we need harnessing collective intelligence. It's the only way to actually re-legitimize the system. So if you ask me, I think we do need a vast set of new measures and new indices. It's probably premature because not enough of it is happening. But it would be great if, as we start to do more citizens' conventions and deliberative polls and whatever, we start to figure out fairly quickly and start to try to measure, are the outcomes better?
Who do you want to see leading the way and sort of create in this work? I mean, you know, sometimes is it the news media? Is it research institutions, universities? Where do you think the work needs to be done?
I mean, I would say all of the above,
Okay.
right? But actually, I think the way I would frame it is maybe slightly different. That I think this is bubbling up and emerging and trying to take hold. And in a way, it's more like who needs to do what. It's like who needs to open the door. Mm-hmm. Elected representatives probably need to open the door to this stuff to have a hold. Who needs to be more kind of... so one of my favourite... one of the things that I think is so interesting in UK democracy in recent years has been the climate assembly that we had. That barely is heard of, really, but it was commissioned by 6 select committees of our parliament, but it didn't have a kind of a binding or legislative power. It came about in response to Extinction Rebellion protests, largely. I mean, there were other triggers for it. But because it didn't have that formal binding thing, XR didn't rejected it, said it wasn't what they were after, and then kind of ignored it. My sort of thought experiment is like, what if they'd said yes and to that? What if they'd said, brilliant that there's
Right.
and let's make sure that the government actually pays. Let's try and make sure it does have binding power by the end of it. Let's get conversations going all around the country in parallel. So I guess, and the reason why I say that is because I think movements have agency in this situation as well, but might need to think differently. Governments need to open up and see the value of this and see the opportunity of it rather than defending against it. Movements need to lean in behind some of these things and be a bit more yes and rather than no but.
But we do have to figure out how to do it right. I mean, there's a lot
Right.
of things that can go wrong
Sure.
in these processes, right? If you promise, like, this is what happens, this is what happened after with the Gilets jaunes and
Right.
the riots in France. They did the Citizens Convention on Climate. Macron came out right in advance and said, we're going to it's going to go right to the parliament. It's not going to be filtered, whatever comes out of this process. And the question, one, was way too broad. It was like, what do we do about climate change? And they put it to the people. The convention was actually, I think, run very well. But as a result, they came up with 144 different recommendations.
Right.
Each of which it needs to be turned into a piece of policy, legislation, has a cascading effect. It's going to take years for the parliament to get through all of them.
But do you think it was worth the effort?
It was absolutely worth the effort. I think it was a good, and I think they ran it really well. Actually, the organization that ran it did some things right. But I think giving a legislative mandate at the beginning was probably the right thing to do, because then it has teeth. But you also have to make sure the scope of the question is more narrow. You have to make sure that you give them a directive like 5 recommendations or something. You know, so there are ways that this can go wrong. And I don't want to confuse participatory and deliberative processes with referendum.
Right.
Direct democracy can be, in my opinion, very dangerous and really, really mismanaged. I'm from California, and it's been the tail wagging the dog
We
for
both
about
live in
30
the UK,
years.
so I think we've
I think we've got
attention
Right,
to this over the
exactly.
last few years.
You got a crash course in what can go wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, California's been living with it for 30 years, and it is completely captured by special interests. So all of these require, look, you have to be really careful about how you do these things, and I feel like we kind of have to learn how to do them, but the ultimate goal is to have them formalized into government, and then there is decision-making power.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I agree in some ways, and like I think so. The Convention Citoyenne in France, like a lot of those recommendations, arguably were very, in a way, Macron kind of slightly overpromised that he could see them straight into law, whereas they would have to go through Parliament in French law. And so I agree there was some sort of technical, like, could have been made clearer, figuring out the contracts.
No, he
of
said
power
they
with
would
these
go
things.
directly to the parliament.
He
He
said
said
they
they
would go
wouldn't
direct to
go
law.
filtered. And so, yes, so that, no, he made good on his promise, but now can the parliament make good on
Can
it?
they deliver? And similarly, we see with the conference on the future of Europe at the moment, what power structure does that? And to the yes and spirit is these are evolving, they're coming in, and we can do more and keep understanding them. I think the thing about, like, I am inherently slightly suspicious of referenda, but equally, like, take the case of Ireland, where the proposal for legalising abortion up to 12 weeks came from a citizens' assembly and then went to referendum.
Exactly.
That was a very positive process, and I have some sympathy as a Brit. I have like what happened. Like, it shouldn't have got to the stage where the only moment when we could realise that our country wasn't unified and in a happy place was such a decision and made in such a way. Like, and I think that the useful distinction, coming back to kind of measures, is like, is when we only have measures of economic thriving, like material standards of living, we could sort of miss a lot of the sense of powerlessness that was spreading across our country. And so it takes you to a place where it goes back to your point, really, that if you only have measures of the old forms of the static forms of democracy, to use your language, that then you don't see what's coming, and then the only outlets become a moment that then actually in Britain has probably made people lose faith in democracy.
Right.
A lot of people in the kind of meritocracy in those structures sort of feel that the people can't be trusted, actually.
Right.
Which is then deeply insidious.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's, we've got a little bit away from the question of metrics, but you brought it back because I think, as I said at the beginning, I think obviously the question of metrics touches on raises so many more issues about how we think about and perceive our democracy, how we participate in it, which is what we've gotten into. We're kind of running out of time a little bit, and I wanted to make sure we had a chance to take questions from the audience. So I'm going to open it up to the both studio audience and to the digital audience. I'm going to start with a question from the digital audience, and then I'll go to the audience here. Someone says, how can we add perspectives of democracy from non-Western countries into our current understanding of democracy, which is shaped primarily by Western thought? This gets at some of what we were discussing earlier about sort of power imbalances, about different perceptions. I'm curious to hear what you think, Dawn.
I mean, I think, and maybe this is, Western democratic hubris. I mean, I do think we have a pretty good idea of what we're trying to achieve with democracy and sort of the levers you pull to create it. It shouldn't be a different standard for different places, right? Do you have the rule of law? Do you have civil liberties? Do you have, elections? Maybe not. Do you have elections? I mean, and I'm just talking about representative democracy right now, which as far as I can tell, most of the developing, and again, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I haven't seen, massive evolution of democracy in these places. So I'm presuming they are practicing some form of representative democracy. And for that, I do think we have pretty good measures. Some of them more robust and deep, some of them, very shallow, as we discussed. But I don't think they should be judged by a different standard. It's a set of values that I think we purport to be sort of universal, based and embedded in human rights.
I'll be very quick in addition. I'll take it in a slightly different direction in that I think actually I would argue some of this is about having the humility to learn from. So arguably the leading participatory democracy in the world right now is Taiwan. And the sort of measures of open government and and another place where one of the most potentially interesting experiments in the future of democracy is developing. Experiment sounds bad, but is in Chile with the Constitutional Convention. Like these are models that, in some ways, to the way I put it earlier, are kind of challenging Western democracy to evolve.
Right. Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I mean, opening yourself up to learning is exactly the way to do that. It's about being humble enough to say that we don't know everything, we don't have all the answers, which, as we were discussing earlier,
but we do have some basic principles.
We have some principles, which is what Dawn is saying exactly, right? Let's see in the audience right here in the very front, if you could please take off your mask and identify yourself.
Yes, thanks very much. So I'm Claudia Chwalisz. I lead the area of work on innovative citizen participation at the OECD, and it's been really exciting actually to hear that this conversation about measuring democracy has been a lot about reinventing democracy and not thinking just within the constraints of democracy equals elections. And a lot of the indices that exist today focus so much just on that model of seeing things. So really curious to hear, are the new indices that you're both working on really going into the depth of thinking about how do we measure all of these new participatory and deliberative processes? To what extent are they being institutionalized? To what extent are they being done well? One of the things we published last year at the OECD are the OECD good practice principles for deliberative processes. Is there a sense of thinking, can we incorporate actually those principles into how we're measuring the quality of democracy today? Is that something that you're thinking about?
Yes, so the index that we created it's actually kind of 3 indices in one. It's the quality of democracy, it's the quality of government, because we believe state capacity is actually really, really important at delivering the third one, which is quality of life. And so in the quality of government, quality of democracy, we are thinking about those things. We haven't cracked the nut, frankly, and one of the problems is it will. Some countries are doing it, but they're one-off. Not many have, Taiwan being an exception, instituted them. And so can you really count it and measure it if it's just sort of a one-off experiment? Or do you really want to evaluate them on the basis of, are they integrating it? So we have some questions to answer. But I think really importantly, and this goes back to our discussion before, what if we were to design what we want and then look at what we have and try to figure out and measure against what it is we're trying to create. That would be a really valuable index for participatory processes.
The only thing I would add, really, because I'm more of an outsider challenging these organisations, I guess, is almost to throw the question back to you and your organisation and to the OECD, whose measures are so influential in the global conversation. What if the OECD were to have an index of the evolution of democracy, or an index of participatory democracy? Like that would send such an incredible signal to around the world. So I think, I mean, it's work in progress everywhere, right? But there are things that all organisations and stakeholders can do in this.
Definitely. It's a good dream. One more question. I think we have time for one last question, and then we're going to have to wrap things up. But please.
Hello, my name is Adam Hinden. I attend the College of Worcester in Ohio, and I'm here with the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. And I'm just wondering, how can these standards for measuring democracy allow for cultural difference? And if we have these standard or universal measures that we're kind of applying universally, to what extent does democracy then become a colonial idea that is being imposed on groups that self-understandings may not correspond with values of liberal democracy as we understand them in the West?
I think echoes of previous conversations we've been having, but I think put very forwardly.
I mean, the way I would answer is to say, firstly, there's significant evidence from the modern day that this desire for agency is pretty universal. But also, if you look back into history, we're not talking about there's this lovely phrase. I have a book coming next year called Citizens: Why the Key to Fixing Everything is All of Us. And what I'm deliberately doing is drawing on very different thought traditions in developing these ideas and this argument. And one of the strands that you find, digging back beyond the sort of agricultural revolution, going back before that, is the idea of campfire democracy. That actually, like, deliberation around a campfire as to where we go next, without sort of without it being the men who made the decision, is actually like super deep in indigenous societies. And so what I would say is this is about the humility, not just to learn from around the world, but to learn from our own deepest history and interrogate far beyond the kind of colonial age, to understand, like, what is it that really makes us human? What does agency mean to us? What do we need in order to have meaningful lives? And not to sort of project onto others, but to understand that there is, and seek something that is fundamentally human. And I do believe the idea that, like, we need to have a stake in shaping our own lives is a fundamental human need.
And I just wanted to add, I think it's a really important question. I think that the model of democracy, representative democracy, that we've tried to deliver around the world, the panel on Afghanistan earlier this morning, I think is a case in point. It doesn't necessarily work for everyone. But I think in reinventing democracy with participatory processes, the opportunity for there to be really, like, a huge variety that is infused with local culture, right? I mean, I believe that democracy should start in your community. It starts on the ground. It starts by connecting communities so they can come together and work out problems and you know, become a community. And those are resilient communities.
Right.
And how a community does that is going to be very culturally defined.
Right.
So I think deliberative democracy and participatory democracy is an opportunity to really create a massive mosaic of what democracy looks like for and by the people.
I think that's a great point to end on. I think that we've sort of taken it to the biggest questions from a very technical one. I think this is a great panel. Thank you so much to Dawn and John. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Well done.
And now, please stick around. We're going to hear next from Ian Selecki, the founder of Polemics, a debating app. Should be a really spirited debate. I'm looking forward to that. Thanks, everyone.